Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Tuesday, August the 20th, and we get another opportunity to spend this morning together. Hope you're waking up feeling refreshed and ready to begin a new day. It's a little overcast this today. As you can tell, I have an appointment that I have later on this morning, so it's probably the first time I actually put on a shirt and a tie for Seize the Day. Usually I'm thinking about what t-shirt I'm going to put on. But I'm glad to be here with you this morning. Had my grandson from Oregon. His name is Jake. He flew in last night. So he's going to be with me for a couple of days. So grateful for that. We're going to have some fun. They're old enough now to do some traveling, and so we get to be the beneficiary of that. So we're going to have some fun. We are in a series called The Songs of Ascents, and these are songs found from the Psalms 120 to 134. I can appreciate a commentary that looked at these Psalms in terms of five triplets. So beginning at at chapter Psalm 120, he groups them in groups of three, and sees how there's a psalm that speaks about some type of distress. The next psalm will deal about power. The next about security. And it fits pretty well in a pattern that you find here in Psalm 120 through 134. And so I just throw that out there as you're reading these psalms, because sometimes if you read them all in one sitting, you might get the impression that they seem to hit on some of those same themes, but there are some interesting nuances and variances in each one of these psalms that I think are worth our notice. Right? Like so, if you ever want to go back and listen to the sermons that were preached on the weekend, you can find them there at bethanychurch.com. And in addition, our worship director Drew Yount took one of these psalms, each one of these psalms, and put them to music. And so you can find that also on bethanychurch.com, and I think you'd find that very enjoyable. Drew's a very talented musician and a great singer, and just did a marvelous job of bringing these psalms to life as he has recorded them, and you'll find them on bethanychurch.com. Just go to our sermon series, and you'll find all that music there. If you ever miss an episode of our Seize the Day, you can always find them on our YouTube channel at Bethany Church NH, and there you could always pick up maybe an episode or so if you're traveling, don't get a chance to tune in when they're being recorded live. Today, what I'd like to do is have us take a look at Psalm 126, and then I'm going to have us move over to Psalm 51. And so if you would turn in your Bibles to Psalm 126, I think this would be a good place just to remind ourselves again of what this text is all about. There is, as one commentator said, more explicitly than any of the other songs of ascents, this one is related to Israel's return from the exile, and so the translation, when the Lord brought back the captives to Zion, there is some debate on whether it should be captives or fortunes, and I explained a little bit yesterday that if it is clear from verses 1 and 4 that the psalm is about restoration of some kind, it's clear also that it falls into two equal halves. They open with similar wordings, right? But there in the beginning, there's laughter, there's joy that's coming out of our mouths, right? Our tongues are singing, these songs of joy and songs. But then you turn to verse 5, and there's sowing with tears, and there is, this kind of lament that we see is going to be resolved as God begins to work more and more in people's lives. And this picture, it kind of answers each other. And so um, I brought to the forefront a couple of these passages as we looked at them. So let's just read the psalm one more time this morning. It says, "When the Lord brought back the captives to Zion, we were like men who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy." So there is this sense of they are looking back now on what God has done. And if you've ever had that experience, which I'm sure we all have, you sit there and you just can't think how a particular situation got resolved. It just seemed impossible. It didn't seem as if there was going to be any way that this was going to be resolved. I've had a pretty interesting history with churches. My first church, the senior pastor had fell morally, and it had a devastating effect on the church. I remember as a young man just watching the church go through this just terrible, terrible ordeal, and really not knowing what to do other than I remember going into my office one day and just telling the Lord, Lord, I feel so ill-equipped. I was all of maybe 28, 29. It was literally from one day to the next that the church was without its pastor. He had fallen in a very grievous way, and now I was left to pick up all these pieces. I felt like watching a demolition show on television where a building just implodes upon itself, and you see it just crumbling from within. And I remember just praying to the Lord and just saying, Lord, I really don't know what to do. And I remember I was at the time reading through the book of Corinthians, and it suddenly dawned on me that the letter to Corinthians was written to the issues that the people were facing in that particular time. Paul, throughout the book, is addressing particular questions and issues that are happening within the Corinthian community. And so as I began to hear the people in this church begin to voice their concerns and their anger and just all this emotion, I began to filter out what I thought people were really asking, what they were really seeking, and I would talk on those things. And I remember after a season sitting back and seeing that the church had gained some momentum and we were moving in the right direction. And I just sat there and I thought to myself, how did this happen? Because I never, ever, ever thought that this would be resolved. I left that church, and I remember I took another church in New York. It was in Tarrytown, New York. And back in 1989, we had a fire that completely destroyed our building. It leveled it right to the ground. It happened on the 23rd of December on a Saturday night. So Sunday was Christmas Eve. It happened late in the afternoon, early evening. And so for many in our church who would be driving into the church, there wasn't the same, level of communication like there is today, right? No real cell phones that people were carrying around with them. That was back in the day when people had beepers, and you would think you were kind of important, right? If you had this little beeper on your belt, until you got one, and then you realize, oh my gosh, they can get a hold of me anytime they want. But I remember sitting there on early, Christmas Eve morning with my wife, and she was, as I was, very emotional. The church, to give you an idea, there was 100 firemen that fought this fire. They were from 5 different companies. It was a huge building, 55-foot ceilings, a stone tower that was about 125 feet up in the air. It was quite the fire. It destroyed everything. That fire was so hot that it actually peeled the stone like you would an orange. It was devastating, and the destruction was complete. And as they had began to get control of that fire, now it was 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I remember sitting there thinking, "What am I going to do? I, the church is gone." And and then a thought occurred to me that there'd be people who were coming, and they have no idea of what happened. They're going to be coming in Christmas Eve morning, expecting a service, and they're going to find this huge barricade all around the property line, and everything charred, no roof. It looked like a war zone that you read about in World War II. The steam was still rising because that's how hot this was, and it would do that for the better part of a month. And I was sitting there with my wife, and I remember I bought her for some reason. My wife's not really big on jewelry, but I bought her a ring that day. And this is a true story. I brought her a ring, and I remember taking my boys down to uh, uh, the Diamond District in New York City, and it was next to Chinatown. So I took my boys, and we all had Chinese food, and I told them, I said, we're going to buy mom a ring for Christmas. And we shopped around, and I went down there, and I picked it up, and and I thought my Christmas was going to be entirely different. Only um, with the course of events, everything was now turned upside down. And and I remember sitting there now, and I brought my wife, and we both sat on the couch, and we lived in a church parsonage, which was right next door to the church. What separated the church from our house was a good-sized lawn, and then a driveway. So the fire didn't affect our house, other than just some smoke from the fire, but there was never any danger of the house itself burning. But at the time, they didn't know that, right? So they evacuated everyone. And so by the end of the day, we were able to go back into our house, even though it was still kind of smoky. And I sat there with her. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning. And I pulled out this ring. And, and I said, our Christmas is going to be really different this year. And, and I talked about this diamond that was in the ring, and how under pressure, this carbon, it produced such a beautiful stone. And no joke, I don't know how I got that idea, but it was just like the Lord gave it to me. And we sat there, and I said, we're going to be under a lot of pressure, but God does his greatest work under pressure. He has a way of tempering us and making things real. And we had just lived through that horrendous episode, in this church that I just finished speaking about, where the pastor fell. So we were not unacquainted with hardships. But here we are now in this new ministry, and everything seems like it's going to go great. And the next thing you know, we're dealing with this fire. And I remember sitting on the couch and telling her about how this diamond was formed out of such pressure, and that God is forming us. But he's forming us together, so we're going to be one. And what he's going to do in the church, we're just going to have to trust him, because we have no idea what's coming next. And I remember we embraced, and she was so exhausted. She went to bed, and I couldn't sleep. And I'm sitting there thinking about, what am I going to tell these people tomorrow? And I thought about Isaiah chapter 61, where God says that he will exchange beauty for ashes. In fact, I have Psalm 51 here, but this morning I'm gonna change that, and I want to talk to you a little bit in the closing moments of this morning of Isaiah 61, because I think this will drive home this point of restoration even more. So if you have your Bibles open and you want to turn to Isaiah 61, it's a great passage, and this is all about the Lord's favor and how he could restore things. This is a great passage for this. He says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord, for the display of his splendor. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. Aliens will shepherd your flocks. Foreigners will work your fields and vineyards. You will be called the priests of the Lord. You will be named ministers of our God. You will feed on the wealth of nations, and in their riches you will boast. Instead of their shame, my people will receive a double portion. Instead of disgrace, they will rejoice in their inheritance, and so they will inherit a double portion in their land, and everlasting joy will be theirs." You see, this is a psalm that Isaiah wrote, but Isaiah was one of those prophets that were telling people, warning them of the coming destruction that would be brought not only by the Assyrians, who would completely overrun the northern kingdom, but in Isaiah he also prophesied about the coming of the Babylonians. And yet here in Isaiah chapter 61, God is even looking further down the road, and he's beginning to tell them that this is a word that is promising restoration. This is a word that says one day all this is going to be turned around. And I now think back of that day in Tarrytown, and I remember reading this passage, and it said, God will exchange beauty for ashes. And that whole phrase, right? He says, I'll bestow a comfort to all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve. I'll give you the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. God's saying, I'm going to make you strong. You're going to be able to stand against the storms that are going to be raging against you. And when you read this text, you realize God is the orchestrator of all of this. And when people came to church that Christmas morning, I read this passage. And I said, you might also recognize that the beginning of Isaiah 61 was the very words that Jesus began his ministry with in the Gospel of Luke. When he got up to read in the synagogue and he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. You see, that was Jesus' ministry. He was going to lead us out of this darkness. He was going to restore us back into favor with God, providing us with a promise and a hope that would never disappoint us. And I'll never forget that day. And now I look back, much like Psalm 126, I'm looking back and I couldn't believe what God had done during those years. And it was like a dream, just like it said in Psalm 126. And how the very people who were filled with sorrow and tears, it wasn't long before their mouths were filled with laughter and their tongues with songs of joy. You know what God did that year? He brought in 100 new people into our congregation, meeting in a hall. God had put our church on the map, and people were curious to see how we were going to deal with it. I put a sign on the front lawn of the church, and it said, our future is as bright as the promises of God. And it appeared on the front page of the Daily News in New York City on Christmas Day. See, I believe that God is able to do exceeding abundant beyond all that we could ever think or imagine. And God is promising to do that for us every single day. Psalm 126 is a psalm of restoration. It's a psalm that also is a prayer for God to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And God promises to do that. In all the years that I have been engaged in ministry, I still see that. Both in personal, hardships, but also professional, where I've seen how God has worked in the lives of many, many people that you had no idea. But God has these doors of escape that are sometimes, they are removed from our vision. But God knows exactly what he's doing. And he promises never to leave us or forsake us. I don't know what much more I can add this morning to just encourage your heart than what I just shared with you today. So we're going to end our time, but I hope you go back, read Psalm 61 again. Isaiah 61 again. It's a great psalm of restoration. God promised that to Israel, and Psalm 126 is the fulfillment of that. They are now back in this land, and they're sitting there thinking, how did this happen? God made it happen. And God's going to do things for you and for me, and just encourage us, as we continue this walk with him. So my friends, thank you so much for joining me today on this Tuesday, August the 20th. And I trust that you go out, seize the day, never forgetting that God is good all the time. And the Lord willing, we'll spend some more time again tomorrow. God bless you, my friends. Looking forward to tomorrow.